I will introduce Richard Ashby, who's our last main speaker before we have a round table at the end. Richard is lecturer in theatre, dramas and performance, 1560 to the present. That's quite a range. In the English department at King's College London. And he's the author of a book called King Lear After Auschwitz, Shakespeare, Appropriation and Theatres of Catastrophe in Post-War British Drama, which came out with Edinburgh University Press 4 years ago. But has recently, congratulations, finished his new monograph for Oxford University Press, Shakespeare and Holocaust Writing, Testimony, Literature, Philosophy. He's author of many articles, has new work coming out in the Shakespeare International Yearbook and an edited collection on the topic of Shakespeare and exile. And the title for the talk today is Face Off, Defacement, Ethics and the Neighbour in the Comedy of Errors, which is great because we don't often have the comedies talked. So thank you, Richard.
Thanks so much, Stuart. I think I invited myself to speak today, so I'll thank myself for my invite. It's been a great day. Thanks everyone for their papers. I'm going to jump, I know we're against time, so I'll jump straight in. So perhaps more than any of the mature romantic comedies, the often violently farcical action of the Comedy of Errors puts the identities of its protagonists on the rack, relentlessly undermining the stability of the self. Identity is self-consciously played with, improvised and reinvented in As You Like It and Twelfth Night, but in the Comedy of Errors, it is shattered. So yes, I am looking at a comedy, but I'm probably going to read it more like a tragedy than anything else. If it were not so funny, writes Ruth Nevo, the Comedy of Errors would read like a schizophrenic nightmare. Identities are lost, split, engulfed, hallucinated, imploded. The play stages the traumatic ramifications of a rift between personal and public perceptions of identity, as once familiar others cease to recognize an individual as himself, while unfamiliar others suddenly recognize in him a wholly new identity, a wholly new person, known unto these and to myself disguised. The Comedy of Errors presents to its audience, in the words of Barbara Friedman, a nightmare vision in comic form, as those who are most familiar proclaim one a total stranger, and strangers evince a mysteriously gained familiarity. Antipholus of Syracuse is bafflingly told by Adriana that she is his wife, as is Dromio of Syracuse by Nell, while Antipholus of Ephesus is denied entry into his own home by his wife and his sister-in-law, who strangely fail to recognize him. Your wife, Sir Knave? The serendipitous presence of sets of identical and identically named twins in Ephesus plays havoc with the symbolic order, as Lacan calls it. The system of linguistic signifiers that provides the basis for a recognizable identity and establishes the rules for the relationship between individual and society, such as male, female, husband, wife, brother, sister, master, slave, and so on and so forth. The rupture of the symbolic order reveals identity to be as fragile as it is arbitrary, a fiction that can unravel in a moment. Am I Dromio? Am I your man? Am I myself? But if the Comedy of Errors stages the whirligig of confusions created in the symbolic domain by the existence of identical twins, it also stages the deleterious impact that the breakdown of identity has on the form of the physical body, which for Lacan, as we know, is unconsciously rooted in the imaginary identifications of the mirror stage, the self-confirming psychic images the individual derives from reflecting surfaces. I am transformed, master, am I not? A raving Dromio demands of Antipholus of Syracuse, both in my mind and in my shape. So Dromio loses both his mind and his shape, his symbolic identity, his mind, and his imaginary identity, his shape, the form of his body. Much recent criticism on the Comedy of Errors has been preoccupied with its representation of the collapse of bodily identity, whether it identifies the culprit as the disconcerting fluidity of the early modern marketplace, as in the work of Kiernan and Ryan, or looks to the historical ties between Ephesus and witchcraft. They say this town is full of cousinage. The fragility of the physical body in the play has also been interpreted from a psychoanalytic Lacanian angle, not least in the work of Barbara Friedman, who provides a hugely insightful reading of the way in which a withdrawal of the reflecting gaze of the other person in the play imperils the ostensible physical integrity of the self. Friedman reads the play as a quest for recognition in which characters strive to restore a lost sense of physical wholeness by soliciting the confirming gaze and recognition of the other person. Each character in the play, contends Friedman, is preoccupied with trying to find his or her place in the gaze of another. Without that confirming gaze, the subject succumbs to physical disintegration. The eye sees not itself, but by reflection, as Brutus tells us. So such readings have all usefully drawn attention to the alarming plasticity, the fragility of the body in the play. What has so far been overlooked by critics, however, is the acute anxiety, the hysteria that is aroused by the face in the Comedy of Errors, which is depicted as being uniquely prone to decomposition and disfigurement. The normally repressed precarity of the body is most strikingly dramatized in the play by the fear of defacement, of having the face blotted out, wiped away, or rent apart by others. The face is far from fixed. It is contingent, and it's constantly threatened with decay, disintegration, and destruction. So this paper will make the case that loss of identity in the Comedy of Errors is at its most terrifying a loss of face, where the individual features that go to make up the face constantly threaten to degenerate into blank D-features. To do so, I'm going to concentrate on the representation of Adriana and Aegeon, both of whom are defaced in the play. This defacement is powerfully captured by that word defeature, a word used by both Adriana and Aegeon, and which is unique in the plays The Comedy of Errors. It doesn't appear anywhere else in Shakespeare. This reading of the disfiguring defeatures that beset both Adriana and Aegeon will be undertaken from the same Lacanian perspective adopted by other critics of the play, where defacement is understood to result from a sudden and bewildering withdrawal of an authenticating gaze, the recognition of ourself that's usually conferred by the other. By concentrating particularly on the face, however, I also aim to pay more heed than previous readings of the play to the ethical implications that arise from defacement and the often violent desire for recognition that produces. The Comedy of Errors has been tied to Lacan and to Lacanian notions of the gaze and of the subject. But if the play intersects with these psychoanalytic understandings of the subject, through its representation of the gaze and defacement, it also broaches ethical questions that intersect with the concerns of post-Lacanian theory, particularly as it's been developed by Zizek. Where in the Comedy of Errors, the sudden absence of a confirming gaze leads to a sense of physical atrophy and even complete defacement, the resultant desire for recognition often threatens to collapse the ethical distinction between self and other, where the face of the other person is reduced to a mirror in which the individual narcissistically sees little more than him or herself reflected. So I'd say that such a dramatization of the face-to-face relationship has more to do with Lacan than it does with Levinas. I love Levinas. He writes wonderfully about Shakespeare. I don't think this play particularly speaks to Levinasian ideas, though. For Levinas, the face of the other is the foundation of ethics. Levinas contends that the face embodies the unique, irreplaceable alterity of the other person, which we are ethically called upon to preserve, and that the face-to-face relation is at the basis of all human sociality. But in Lacanian and post-Lacanian theory, the face-to-face relation is more ethically ambivalent. Drawing on Lacan, Zizek rejects the Levinasian idea that faces come ready-made and contends that the face is predicated on the imaginary relationships the individual acquires in the mirror stage and the symbolic identifications facilitated by language, such as man, woman, black, white, old, young, ugly, beautiful, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to tell some Lacanians how to suck their eggs here, unfortunately. I'm going to do a little bit of work on Lacan. But Lacan famously sees the formation of the ego taking place in the reflection of a mirror, in which an image of the body secures the supposed unity of the self. This is the glassy essence that John was speaking about earlier, which almost seems a contradiction in terms, really. This might be an actual mirror, or it may be the face of another, usually the mother. Okay, these aren't my children, by the way. The mirror stage is a drama, writes Lacan, which manufactures for the subject, caught up in the lure of spatial identification, the succession of fantasies that runs from a fragmented body image to a form of its totality. There I am, aren't I beautiful? Yet the image or ideal I in the mirror is not the self per se, but the armour of an alienating identity. The subject originally sees himself from the perspective of the other, so the mirror displaces even as it places the self. Lacan states the subject becomes aware of a reflection from the point of view of the other. He is an other for himself. Who the hell are you? This alienating process means the ostensible unity that the ego derives from the body ultimately relies on the mirroring recognition of other people. To be, one has to be recognized by another. This means that our image, which is equal to ourselves, has to be mediated by the gaze of the other. This obviously has ramifications for the face-to-face relationship. What is gleaned from the face-to-face relation and its relay of gazes is not the ethical alterity of the Levinasian other. Instead, the other provides a mirror in which the subject recognizes him or herself. This process is secured in the symbolic domain of language, which instantiates a realm of common meanings that allow for various identifications to be shared and reflected between self and other. I am Richard, you are Paul, you are Holly. Those are my siblings, by the way, that just popped into my mind. Zizek makes the case that in his conception of the face-to-face relation, Levinas ignores, obfuscates the way in which the face relies on both imaginary and symbolic identifications that preclude the type of ethical revelation that Levinas wants to posit. Far from guaranteeing itself or being an epiphany, this is the word that Lacan uses, the face for Zizek is always already caught up in significations and relationships that disqualify it from being an ethically charged counter with the other person. The face, as Zizek sees it, does not precede and lay the ground for language and society, as Levinas contends. It is produced by language and society. Far from representing a confrontation with pure otherness, the Lacanian and post-Lacanian theorists, the face-to-face relation cannot be disentangled from the same type of narcissistic desire for recognition that I'm going to suggest informs the relation between self and other in the Comedy of Errors. Such a conception of the face-to-face relation means that in post-Lacanian theory, an ethical confrontation with otherness takes place not in the luminous face of the other, but in non-faces, or in those faces that in some way resist our desire for narcissistic reflection. Such a face, or a non-face, does indeed appear in the Comedy of Errors. The terrifyingly bony non-face of the zombie-like living dead man, Dr. Pinch, who is unforgettably portrayed by Antipholus of Ephesus as having, quote, no face. I'll make the case that the mostly off-stage but still show-stopping confrontation between Antipholus and the faceless Dr. Pinch epitomizes the often horrifying way in which others have stopped reflecting the self in the Comedy of Errors. But I will also contend it is in such confrontations where ethical questions most forcefully arise. If the face of the other is simply a mirror in which the subject finds him or herself reflected, the type of non-face embodied by Dr. Pinch resists appropriation, challenging us and our narcissistic sense of self and identity, however horrifying that may be for us. To quote Zizek, the true ethical step is beyond the face of the other. So this is the profound ethical challenge posed by a play that has, for most of its history, been considered a piece of knockabout fun. And as I say, I'm not going to treat it like knockabout fun, unfortunately. How can we accommodate and respond to others that do not reflect ourselves back to us, that challenge us and our sense of identity? What if the imaginary and symbolic identifications that underpin the face break down, or society stops recognizing the faces of its individuals? This is the scenario that Shakespeare powerfully dramatizes in the Comedy of Errors. This collapse of bodily identity is often imputed to time in the play, but wherever time is invoked, the final responsibility for the type of physical breakdown the play depicts lies with the non-recognition of the other. So I'm going to begin with Adriana. Like the Fair Youth sonnets, the Comedy of Errors is concerned with the ravages wrought by injurious time on the body, with the wasting hours that drain vitality and fill the brow with lines and wrinkles. It's my birthday tomorrow, so that's really hitting home for me right now. Antipholus and Dromio of Syracuse contemplate the deforming power of time and a round of bandiage about the ubiquitous sway of bald Father Time over the body, which again is hitting a little bit too close to home. There is no way to undo the damage that time does to the body, Dromio tells Antipholus, and no time for a man to recover hair that grows bald by nature. But the most telling word that Shakespeare employs to denote the ruinous power of time over the body is that word defeature. The OED defines defeature both as undoing or ruin and as disfigurement, defacement, and marring of the features. Though it is not a coinage by Shakespeare, prior to its appropriation by him, the word defeature usually denoted simply defeat or loss, as in the lament for first love's defeature in the Fairy Queen. Its variant meaning as disfigurement, defacement, or marring, the OED notes, is chiefly an echo of its Shakespearean usage. Unique in Shakespearean drama to the Comedy of Errors, the adaptation of the word defeature testifies to its equally unique concern with the horrific possibility of facelessness, of having no face to show to the world. Both the discontented Adriana, who is the wife to Antipholus of Ephesus, and the hapless Aegeon use the word defeature to convey the radical effacement of the self that is inflicted by time. In Act 2, Scene 1, Adriana contemplates the possibility that age, like a dial hand, has wiped away the beauty that once attracted the now estranged Antipholus. Whereas in Act 5, Scene 1, Aegeon confronts the terrifying prospect of age having rendered him completely unrecognizable, of his grained face being hid beneath the scribbling of the deformed hand of time. To say, however, that the face is simply at the mercy of the ravages of the fell hand of time is to miss the importance of the gaze in the Comedy of Errors. The disfeaturing impact of time on the body is apparent only in the presence of others, or more precisely, from the perspective of others. It is only when the self stops being recognized by others, only when the body ceases to relay a recognizable identity to other people, that the wasting power of time is suddenly perceived. So much so that the final responsibility for the physical deterioration that afflicts both Adrian and Aegeon lies not with time at all, but with those individuals who fail to identify them. Now, this rhetorical displacement of the ravaging impact of time on the body is most marked in the bitter complaints that Adriana makes about the roving eyes of Antipholus, who often takes the liberty of gazing at other women and even keeps the company of prostitutes merely to spite his long-suffering wife. I know his eye doth homage otherwhere, she says. Adriana begins Act 2, Scene 1 by wondering whether homely age is taking the alluring beauty from my poor cheek. But if Adriana has indeed been disfigured, defaced, or marred, it is not time that is responsible, but the habitual neglect of her fickle and somewhat feckless husband. It soon becomes apparent that for Adriana, the cause of her defeatures is not old age, but the absent gaze of her husband. His company must do his minions grace, as Adriana confides to Luciana, whilst I at home do starve for a merry look. And she says, what ruins are in me that can be found by him not ruined, then he is the ground, key word I think that, of my defeatures, my decayed fair a sunny look of his would soon repair. So the sunny looks that Adriana is now denied recalls the opening scene of the play, in which Aegeon describes how the gaze of the sun changes the aspect of the earth that it looks upon. At length, the sun, gazing upon the earth, dispersed those vapours that offended us. Bereft of the verifying gaze of Antipholus, the physical features of Adriana have suddenly become susceptible to ruin. Now, the Comedy of Errors certainly stages the gendered hierarchy of the gaze. Antipholus threatens to pluck out the full size of Adriana when she has the audacity to compromise his reverend reputation and shamelessly looks upon the strange harlots who have taken his place at dinner, his twin. But at the same time, the parallel defeaturing of Aegeon prohibits, I think, a strictly or exclusively feminist understanding of looking relations in the play. More profoundly, Shakespeare reveals the underlying dependence of the self on the other and of the face on the confirmation it obtains from the gaze of other people. To put it in Lacanian terms, deprived of the imaginary and symbolic identifications that are facilitated by the person, the subject succumbs to aphanesis or fading, a traumatic glimpse of the lack that for Lacan is intrinsic to our being. Having been defeatured by the absence of a verifying gaze, however, Adriana seeks to perform a linguistic defeaturing of Antipholus, assuring Luciana that my tongue, though not my heart, shall have his will. And she says, he is deformed, crooked, old and seared, ill-faced, worse-bodied, shapeless everywhere, vicious, ungentle, foolish, blunt, unkind, stigmatical in making, worse in mind. Faced with the obvious question, who would mourn the loss of such a one? No evil lost is wild when it's gone. If he's that ugly, what's the problem? Adriana has no choice but to confess the truth. But I think him better than I say, and yet would herein otherwise were worse. My heart prays for him, though my tongue do curse. Adriana, then, is a victim of the same dissatisfaction in love which is diagnosed by Lacan. When in love I solicit a look, what is profoundly unsatisfying and always missing is that you never look at me from the place from which I see you. Of course, the presence of self-same twins in the Comedy of Errors brings the underlying disparity of love to the fore. Ironically, it is the wrong twin that Adriana upbraids in the streets of Ephesus. Antipholus, look strange and frown. Some other mistress hath thy sweet aspects. I am not Adriana nor thy wife. So mistaken identity is a motif that Shakespeare is using in the Comedy of Errors to dramatise the gaps between one gaze and another. The more Adriana pleads with the bemused Antipholus of Syracuse to act if she really is an object pleasing in thine eye, the more she unwittingly betrays the fundamental specular imbalance involved in love, the impossibility of seeing yourself in the gaze of the other. So as the wrangle between Antipholus of Syracuse and Adriana shows, the twins do not upend the day-to-day reality of Ephesus so much as agitate and aggravate its native psychic discord, particularly those created by the distance between the place of one look and the place of another. Lacan writes, what defines the eye at the most profound level in the visible is that gaze that is outside, since in the scopic field the gaze is outside, I am looked at, that is to say, I'm a picture. I can never make head nor tail of Lacan's graphs that he uses, if I'm being perfectly frank, but maybe someone else can. I'll put one up anyway. The impossibility of merging with the place of the gaze, though, means that the picture is always liable to fade, as distinguishing features are based on the constitutive defeatures that arise from always being seen from elsewhere. Antipholus truly is the ground, the place of the defeatures that have come to mar the face of Adriana, refusing as he does to take the measure of her body. At the same time, however, in addressing herself to the wrong twin, Adriana unintentionally discloses the arbitrariness of desire. Like the discarded Helena in A Midsummer Night's Dream, who hounds Demetrius to return her devoted affection, or Helena in All's Well That Ends Well, who doggedly pursues the snobbish aristocrat Bertram, the grievances that Adriana addresses to the bewildered Antipholus of Syracuse reveal that to be desire is, in effect, to need to be desired. All human desire, as Coverjay writes in his work on Hegel, is ultimately driven by the desire for recognition. So Adriana reminds, of course, the wrong Antipholus in this angry anaphoric litany that the time was once when thou, unurged, wouldst vow that never words were music to thine ear, that never object pleasing in thine eye, that never touch welcome to thy hand, that never meat sweet savoured in thy taste, unless I spake, or looked, or touched, or carved to thee. So if desire is the desire of the other, as Lacan says, or springs from the fundamental desire to be recognised, to be desired, the other called upon to do the recognising cannot truly be said to be the cause or the object of desire. Since a gap necessarily manifests itself between the ostensible recipient and the cause of desire, there really is no object of love, only its semblance. Driven by a tyrannical desire for recognition, Adriana fails to grasp that she spends nearly the whole of the play haranguing a complete stranger, a stranger whose very name, Antipholus intimates antiphilia or anti-love, as Ross King has written, signifies a resistance to the overbearing nature of love and desire. As Zizek contends, the desire of the other throws up the enigma or the mystery of what it is that the other wants. Finding oneself in the position of the beloved is, like Zizek, a violent traumatic event. Being loved makes the subject feel directly the gap between what he or she is as a determinate being and the unfathomable X inside which causes love. The Lacanian definition of love, love is giving something one does not have, has to be supplemented with to someone who does not want it. And Antipholus of Syracuse does not want it. This arbitrary is, as Zizek understands it, partly due to the troubling lure of the face, which serves not as the incarnation of absolute alterity, as Levinas would have it, but as a self-confirming mirror in which the individual sees him or herself reflected. What Adriana wants to see in the sweet aspects of Antipholus is, of course, herself, her own beauty ratified and reflected back to her. This mirroring precludes the type of ethical epiphany that Levinas imagines taking place in face-to-face relations. What such relations, perhaps confrontations, reveal in the Comedy of Errors is a form of narcissism, as opposed to an overwhelming moral responsibility that somehow disarms the desiring self, as Levinas says. Indeed, not finding oneself actively reflected by the other prompts, I think, the repeated threats of physical violence against the face in the play. Adriana gives Antipholus free rein to tear the stained skin from her harlot brow if she were ever to prove prey to ruffian lust and compromise his social standing by proving unfaithful. When it seems that she has done precisely that, Antipholus promises to scorch and disfigure her face, a punishment that he ends up meting out to Dr. Pinch, whose face is singed with brands of fire and nicked with scissors. So the Comedy of Errors is quite remarkable in its quantity and the severity of the violence that it depicts, but much of that violence is directed towards the face in the play. So I'm going to turn now to Aegeon. I'm going to skip straight ahead into what he has to say about his defeatures. This is the moment when Antipholus of Ephesus, who of course has never met him before, and Dromio fail to recognize him and tell him they don't know who he is. He says, "O grief hath changed me since you saw me last, and careful hours with time's deformed hand have written strange defeatures in my face." But of course, it is not time which has made Aegeon unrecognizable. He has simply appealed to the wrong set of twins, thereby illustrating how a perceived lack or loss in the self in the play springs from a failed relationship to other people. Time and again, Aegeon asks these twins to remember him, or if they can remember him, with the obvious pun on remember, put the body back together for me, please. So Aegeon might begin the play by narrating his labour of a love to see, Amelia and the lost twins, but in the final few moments of the Comedy of Errors, he's only really labouring to be seen, to be recognised for the man he is, or the man, at least, that he thinks he is. Now, by the end of the play, by the recognition scene, everyone is, of course, seen to be who they really are, and identities are restored. But if our sense of self relies on the other, our fear of non-reflection can never finally be resolved. And this fear in the Comedy of Errors constellates around that weird figure of Dr. Pinch. So if the play depicts an ethically problematic desire for recognition that reduces the face-to-face relation to narcissistic reflection, there is a face, or indeed a non-face, in the play that resists appropriation. This is the grotesquely bony saffron face of Dr. Pinch, the gazing and hollow-eyed skeletal figure called upon to cure Antipholus of Ephesus. This aligns Dr. Pinch with a figure that Zizek, following both Freud and Lacan, designates as the neighbour. Here he is. Once free of the dark and dankish vault in which Pinch performs his occult ministrations, the traumatized Antipholus recalls being but one Pinch, a hungry, lean-faced villain who, with no face as 'twere, outfacing me, cried out I was possessed. So if the mere anatomy Dr. Pinch is indeed the uncanny spiritus rector of the Comedy of Errors, it is because his faceless face epitomizes the often horrifying way in which others have stopped reflecting the self in the play. It might even be said that the faceless Pinch embodies the disturbing transformation of usually predictable others in the Comedy of Errors into unpredictable, volatile, and ultimately unknowable others who hystericize and provoke the self. So Zizek writes that beneath the gentrifying face of the other, which acts as a mirror image of the self, lies the unfathomable abyss of radical otherness, of a monstrous thing that cannot be gentrified. If so, Dr. Pinch evokes the horror of the neighbour thing in the Comedy of Errors, the uncanny, implacable presence that remains when the imaginary and symbolic props that usually make the relationship between people possible, or as Zizek says rather characteristically, minimally bearable, have broken down. He says, from a Freudian perspective, face is the ultimate mask that conceals the horror of the neighbour thing. Face is that which makes the neighbour similar, a fellow man with whom I can identify and empathise. Lurking beneath the face of the neighbour is, Zizek says, an unknowable void, an abyss that cannot be plumbed. The neighbour is the evil thing which potentially lurks beneath every homely human face. Or as Zizek also puts it, the neighbour is the other qua real, the impossible thing, the inhuman partner, the other with whom no symmetrical dialogue mediated by the symbolic order is possible. So this shift from the Levinasian face, the non-face of the neighbour, reflects a move away from a conception of ethics, in which the question is how to build a tolerant human society that respects the other, to a concern with the inhuman aspect of the other, its monstrous excess. Dr. Pinch can, I think, be said to embody such a figure, but in doing so, he also encapsulates the ethical challenge posed by the play. How to accommodate and respond to others that do not reflect the self, that challenge the subject with a destabilizing sense of over-proximity. Mary Ritchie puts the point very pithily. Whenever the thing pierces our customary imaginary and symbolic supports, we lose our social balance, as well as our phantasmic sense of security. But the most important feature of post-Lacanian ethics, continues Ritchie, is the emphasis on the idea that a properly ethical attitude must risk these supports, must risk an encounter with the unsettling real of the other and its devouring jouissance. Now, this is not something evinced by Antipholus of Ephesus in his terrifying encounter with Dr. Pinch, or indeed at any point in the play, but it is, I think, epitomized by his twin. What? Was I married to her in my dream, wonders Antipholus of Syracuse after his initial encounter with the overly proximate Adriana, or sleep I now and think I hear all this? Either way, Antipholus of Syracuse evinces a truly remarkable willingness to risk entertaining the offered fallacy, as he calls it, to act as if he really might have married Adriana. This willingness, of course, serves an obvious narrative purpose. The drama, the action of the play could hardly continue if Antipholus simply refused Adriana. I don't know who you are, go away, the play ends. Yet it also has an ethical dimension. Antipholus boldly risks an encounter with the unsettling real of the other, an encounter divorced of the usual imaginary and symbolic supports that ensure his identity. So it may seem odd for him to simply go along with Adriana and her utterly inexplicable desires, but it may be the only ethical thing that he can do. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.